Okay, here we go. Well, I'm going to try to talk about the the assigned reading for this past Thursday when I did not feel well, from John Polkinghorne, Serious Talk, Science and Religion and Dialogue. John Polkinghorne has passed away just in the last year, two at the most. He was, we just had our Wiley lectures in theology this past week at Point Loma, and he was our very highly esteemed Wiley lecturer at Point Loma, 10, 12 years ago, I suppose. We've had some, I would say, some very significant big names over the years with the Wiley lectures. And in the world of theology, Polkinghorne is probably up there with one other person, a guy by the name of John Cobb, who have given the Wiley lecturers, both of whom are, well, in Polkinghorne's case now were. Cobb is still alive at 98, but these are probably the two most internationally known and recognized figures, within theology. And specifically, well, they're both actually quite involved in science and theology discussions. I would say Polkinghorne even more so, since he was not just an Anglican priest and trained in theology, but a physicist, PhD in physics, and taught that for a long time. So he's a natural when it comes to the subject matter of our course. He mentions a few times that he calls himself a bottom-up thinker, and he tells us what that means right on the first page. He says, I'm naturally a bottom-up thinker rather than a top-down thinker. Top-down, you'd start with big general principles that you assume and then try to look at, evidence to support your principles, I suppose. He says, by this I mean that my instinct is to start with a phenomenon. Phenomenon is the singular, phenomena is the plural. A phenomenon is some event or occurrence or observable, happening, something I'm trying to understand and explain, and then to build up from that, rather than starting with some broad general principles and working downward from them. Well, I'm sure that all of us are some creative combination of both, bottom up and top down. But to the extent that Polkinghorne is a bottom-up thinker, he's saying, I really try to observe the world around me carefully. And obviously that includes his understanding of the Christian faith, as he tells us later. On page 3, I was really delighted and had forgotten. I read this book. Oh my goodness, I think I read this book in 1997, so it's been a while. On page 3, he says, about midway through the first, or that big paragraph, if we are to understand the nature of reality, he writes, we have only two possible starting points. I'm not sure if it's necessarily the case, but I certainly assume something like this often. The two possible starting points: either the brute fact, the brute fact of the physical world, that it simply is, or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. This is actually the subject of my little limerick that I, shared with you a couple weeks ago. But in the fifth line of the limerick, I wondered if there might be some other thing besides these two possibilities. I'm not sure that there are, but it's fun that we've already talked quite a bit about this idea of brute fact. Why should one go back beyond the material world to look for the will of a divine agent? He asks later on the same page, page 3, a creatorly purpose at work in the world. The question where you start or stop is a question of where you feel intellectually comfortable. Where, there's a typo here, it shouldn't say were, but where you feel that you have a basic belief that is not begging important questions. I think, though, that in a sense, whatever our basic belief is, it's going to beg certain important questions. We can't avoid that, as far as I can tell. He then talks a bit, interestingly, about the sort of crazy thing that our minds seem fit to interpret the world effectively, particularly with the use of mathematics, and that's rather interesting. It points to something, it seems, beyond simply evolution in order to survive in particular contexts, physical contexts. Our capacity for mathematics goes well beyond that, it seems to me, and to other people, and does raise interesting questions. It doesn't prove something particularly, but it does raise interesting questions about the possibility, we'll say, of an ultimate mathematician, a mind, the mind. He talks about this fine-tuning of the laws of nature that we've already encountered in Giberson, and it's a nice exploration of that on page 5. At the bottom of the big paragraph on page 5, which is a nice paragraph, he says, we live in a world, a 1 in a trillion world, basically. What do we make of that? And he talks about the next page, various explanations for that fine-tuning involved in the anthropic principle. One is maybe there are lots and lots of different universes, and if there are, then it is not very surprising if one of them happens to have the particular physical laws and circumstances that make you and me possible. If you've read, you know that Polkinghorne is not terribly impressed with the many-world theory. He kind of, in fact, finds it baloney. I like on page 7, he says, I'm not saying that because the universe is intelligible to our minds, that God therefore exists, or because our existence requires fine-tuning of the laws of nature, that God exists. I do not think there are any knockdown arguments of that sort, either for God's existence or for God's non-existence. That, of course, is itself intellectually and theologically interesting and noteworthy, that very likely that kind of proof, either for or against a creator, a divine creator in power, lacking that, we are left with risk. We don't have proof. We have to venture. We have to go on an adventure, intellectually and often spiritually speaking, that calls to us but does not guarantee the outcome in advance. Sounds a lot like what faith might entail. He talks about the beautiful structures of meaning in music, talks about moral experience, religious experience. So on bottom of 8, so we have this richly structured world in which we live. An attraction of religious belief is that it ties together all those forms of experience. Some nice stuff there. Nothing all that beautiful about the roar of a motorcycle. Well, in my opinion. Speaks here in this early chapter about the resurrection of Jesus and the sort of unexpected notes, or not what we would expect. I guess that's unexpected. For one thing, the importance of women in the appearances of Jesus, the stories of Jesus' appearance after his crucifixion, and as he says, in almost all the stories, there is a very unexpected motif that pops up in different ways. That is, how difficult it was to recognize Jesus. Both of these are really fascinating. I actually remember him speaking of the first point. He might have done both, probably did at Point Loma, but I remember his talking at length, I think in chapel maybe, about the sort of unexpected oddity of women having such a central role in the Gospels' testimonies regarding the resurrected Jesus, given that women typically were not deemed trustworthy in either Jewish or Roman cultures. So If you were making up a story and wanting to convince people that Jesus had survived crucifixion, saying that he appeared to women or that women saw him wouldn't exactly be a strike in your favor. But also, if you were making up a story, it would be sort of unexpected that you say, he was really hard for people to recognize. There was something strange and mysterious about all this that seemed to require some kind of gift of recognition beyond simply, oh, there's Jesus, and that's interesting stuff. He also talks about the last two things he talks about. Well, actually, he's got three here, doesn't he? The suffering, the problem of suffering in the world. He talks also about miracles, pages 14 and 15, and the third he said the third difficulty I must mention for honesty's sake, and it's about the various religious traditions of the world. You can read that. I think he thinks or says that that's a difficulty because he wants to assume that religious faith, to some extent, reflects a human awareness of God that would transcend religious traditions, and yet it seems that religious traditions can be quite different from each other, which they are, which is part of the fascination. Nonetheless, he says, I really do believe in the search for truth. So do I. Hope you do too. And the search for a unified truth, one truth about one world. I also believe, and this is a Christian tradition, that those who are truly seeking understanding, who are truly seeking the truth and are open to it, are seeking God, whether they name God by name or not. That's a good place to stop. It's near the end of the first chapter. Just hitting some of the high points of the opening chapter of Polkinghorne. I'll come back with another in just a second.